Week 11 fantasy football, 3 must-start wide receivers. Right before the Week 10 bye, T. Higgins in Week 9 caught 7 of his 9 targets for 121 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns for 33.1 fantasy points. Higgins has now scored 4 touchdowns across the last 2 weeks and has finished with over 95 receiving yards in 2 of those games. The Bengals get a rematch against the Steelers in Week 11, who allowed the second most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the most passing yards per game at 269.4. In Week 7 against the Steelers, Higgins caught 6 of his 10 targets for 96 yards and a touchdown, which was 21.6 fantasy points. Jalen Waddle has finished with 99, 82, and then 84 receiving yards the last 3 weeks, with 2 touchdowns scored during that span. And that production has meant 20.9, 14.2, and 19.4 fantasy points. He also had 95 yards back in Week 6 and 110 yards in Week 5. And for Week 11, the Dolphins face a Commanders defense that allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 2nd most passing yards per game this season. Devontae Smith has finished 5 games with 60-plus receiving yards. He produced 114 back in Week 5 and 183 in Week 7. He's had some ups and downs for fantasy football, but he's finished 4 weeks with 16-plus fantasy points and 2 weeks with 20-plus fantasy points. And the Eagles will face the Lions in Week 11, who allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. This is the most anticipated game of the week, so we can expect the possibility of a shootout.